If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. We read a few of those verses earlier together, and we're going to pick up on the story that's found there. The story for today, our 31st story of the 52 key stories that help found our faith in Christ, is one that Jesus actually referred to. And he referred to it whenever he was in his hometown of Nazareth. And they were demanding that he do among them what they had heard that he'd done up in the north in Capernaum. They were sort of skeptical about Jesus. They knew his family. They knew his family story. They must have known him. They probably knew those growing up stories about Jesus that we all wish we knew. You know, sort of those absent stories. Well, what about Jesus when he was a kid and when he was a teenager? Well, they knew all those stories because they grew up with Jesus. And they were kind of skeptical. The miracles that Jesus did up in the north were not just about his power and his identity. It was his compassionate response to those who believed that he was who he said he was. That he was the Messiah, that he was God's Son, that he was there to bring about God's deliverance. The crowds of people in Capernaum believed that Jesus could do miracles, and those in his hometown didn't believe that he could do miracles. Now that's an important difference for the story that we're going to look at today. I'm not sure that we'll ever figure out exactly how God's power is fully connected with our faith and how that works out together, but the Bible is full of examples of it working. Jesus told the unbelievers in his hometown that no prophet is welcome in his hometown. And then he told them that there were a lot of widows in Elijah's day, but he only helped a foreigner from Phoenicia or Sidon, depending on your translation. And that many lepers lived in Elisha's day, but only helped a foreigner from Syria. This made them so angry that they drove Jesus out of the city up to a cliff where they were going to throw him off of it. But then, that little part from this story from Luke 4 says, he passed through their midst and went on his way. I don't know how you pass through an angry mob who's wanting to throw you off a cliff. That sounds like a miracle to me, but it's not the kind of miracle they wanted to see. It didn't convince any of them to believe. And then there was that father who came to Jesus with his son. You know how fathers and sons are. His son was suffering these episodic fits. No one could help him. Not even Jesus' own disciples were able to do anything about it. And this father knew what was the matter with his son. This father knew that he had an evil spirit, and that's what was causing all of these problems. And when he sees Jesus, he asks, if you can do anything, have compassion on us. And Jesus answers, if you can. If you can. All things are possible with him who believes. To which the father pleaded, I do believe. Help my unbelief. Then Jesus cast out the evil spirit. His son was healed. These biblical stories are challenging for us in our modern age of science. They bring into view that proverbial elephant that is often in the room with us. That elephant that says, do you really believe that God can do the things that he says he can do? Today's story about Naaman comes from a time in Israel's history that few understand very well. It's hard to keep straight all the alliances and the estrangements that Israel had with all those nations surrounding them and what all the names of those nations were, because they seemed like they kept changing all the time. And to be perfectly honest, when you're dealing with anxiety at work and problems in your home and stress about offending someone over something you don't even really quite understand, I mean, who really cares about some guy who lived forever ago in ancient Aram? You should care, because it offers a lot of insights that will help you in making your next steps in following Jesus. When ancient Israel had been united under King David, as we studied earlier, it had waged a war against Aram. A-R-A-M is the name of that nation. It would later be known as Syria. Damascus was one of their leading cities. But instead of annihilating Aram, Syria. King David allowed them to enter into a peace treaty with them. Although it's not really stated in the Bible, the Arameans seem to have followed and allowed the worship of Israel's God into their society. Conquered nations often did that back then. They did those kinds of concessions. When Israel split into two nations, that north and south that we've been studying recently, after the death of King Solomon, the Arameans saw it as an opportunity to gain their independence, so to speak, from Israel, and possibly even take back some of Israel's territory for their own. At first, they simply just sort of tested the waters, seeing how the northern kingdom of Israel was going to react to their raids. So they would take a military group, they would raid into Israel, they would hit some settlements, they would even capture some people. On one of those raids was a young Israelite girl who was captured, and she was enslaved. She was made to serve the wife of an Aramean military commander, and that commander's name was Naaman. It is the faith of this enslaved girl and her earnest desire for the best of even her captors that sets this whole story in motion. We don't know much about her, not even her name. But she must have been a remarkable young lady who came from a family who still held on to the worship of Yahweh, even though the majority of Israel and that northern group no longer did. It's recorded that Israel's current king at that time was Joram. And he had torn down a pillar that his mother and father, King Ahab and Jezebel, had erected to indicate that only Baal was going to be worshipped in Israel. However, even though he tore that down, it's also recorded that he did not ask his people to embrace Yahweh as their God, nor did he advocate returning to Yahweh's way. King Joram was more of a worship whoever you want to worship, so long as you don't tell me how to live my life, thank you very much. And most of the people he ruled sort of adopted that attitude. They liked the way they were living. They didn't see any problems with it. It was those judgmental followers of Yahweh that were often the problem. But they could tolerate it. At least they were going to try to. Things weren't really much different in Aram, Samaria, up there in Syria, I should say, where Naaman lived. And he was one of those guys that seemed like he was the golden boy. Everything was going right in his life. He had everything that someone might want or desire out of life. He was a great man in the eyes of his master, and he was highly respected. He was a valiant warrior. We're even told that his nation had been given a victory by Yahweh because of him. So we have to kind of assume that Naaman was one of those Arameans who worshiped Yahweh among all the other gods that they worshipped at the minimum. The only thing that Naaman didn't have was his health. He was a leper. But lepers were treated differently up in Aram than they were in Israel. He was not separated from the rest of society, as one might expect. Leprosy, because they didn't separate it, was a little more widespread in Aram than it was in Israel, simply because more people were exposed to it because they weren't isolated from the rest of society as God sort of directed. The Israelite slave girl in Naaman's household was probably a little bit concerned about getting too close to him. Yet, she would also have discovered that he was a follower of Yahweh just as she was, at least to some degree. And while we don't really understand or told what motivated her, we do know that she told her mistress that she wished that Naaman could be with a prophet that she'd heard about who lived in the Samaria region of Israel, because she was certain that he would heal her. You have to remember that prophets who served Yahweh were still very rare in Israel at the time. Even though the people had recommitted themselves to serving Yahweh on Mount Carmel in Elijah's day, they had already turned away from him in Elisha's day, who was sort of the next prophet in line. It wasn't that long ago that Elisha had taken over from Elijah and was trying to bring Israel back to the God that he served and loved. Some would even argue that, well, the people of Israel really never turned around to God at all, even after that dramatic experience. if you're curious, my God is rich. Just like Elijah was, my God is Yahweh, Elishua is, my God is wealthy. Now, it's usually translated as in, my God will provide, or my God will sustain. But the literal part of it is, my God's rich. That would be a good thing to say for people who are in need. Sometimes we quote Jesus as saying, hey, my God is the God who has the cattle on 1,000 hills. We like the idea that God has enough to provide for what we need and even more. It was understood as a declaration that every time his name was spoken, everyone around would understand that his name meant, my God can supply your need. Like Elijah's name, it was sort of a dig at their culture. This group of people who didn't really believe that God could provide, or they would have been searching and seeking him and looking for his help. And sometimes the reason we don't turn to God because we really don't believe he can help either. Even so, Elisha was able to help some people who did believe. And their stories were being told as evidence that Yahweh was the real God. I think it was because of some of those stories that this slave girl believed that Elisha could heal Naaman. True stories, what we might call testimonies, are important. They give us hope and encouragement and help us lean further into our understanding of who God is. They inspire us, they challenge us, and they shape our faith in God. You may have your own story about how God has been working in your life. And if you do, I encourage you to share it. This slave girl's mistress, who was Naaman's wife, told him what the slave girl had said about this prophet. And Naaman immediately acts on it. And that's where we're going to pick up reading the story today. It's in 2 Kings, the 5th chapter. We're going to read, just for the moment, verses 4 through 9. Naaman went in and told his master, saying, Thus and thus spoke the girl who is from the land of Israel. Then the king of Aram said, Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. He departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold, and then 10 changes of clothes. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, And now, as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. When the king of Israel, who wasn't really a believer in God anymore, read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now and see how he is seeking a quarrel against me. It happened when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent word to the king saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots, and he stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty impressed with Naaman. I mean, he was a man of action. He didn't dilly-dally around about his faith. He hears about what can happen. He immediately seeks permission to go to this prophet, which indicates just how badly he wanted to be healed. He would do anything, go anywhere, spend any amount of money if he could just be cured of this one thing that was lacking in his life. Which makes me pretty certain that he had probably tried every possible cure available to him in Aram, and none of them worked. Did you notice the king of Israel's reaction to the letter that Naaman presented him? I like the testimony in it that he says he's quite certain that healing of a leper is strictly sort of a God thing, not a man thing. And since, at least according to Jesus' reference to the story, that there were a whole lot of lepers at that time in Israel, none of whom were healed except for Naaman. It seems that this king is probably looking at Naaman and saying, Hey, God hasn't healed anyone around here who's one of his people. What makes you think you're going to get healed? It seemed like such an impossibility that the king of Israel felt that Naaman had been sent with other intentions of creating an incident of which the king of Aram could take offense and start a war of independence. That's sort of why he ripped his clothes. He didn't know what to do. He was in trouble. But Elisha was also a man of action, and Elisha was also a man of faith. And when Elisha heard about the king's dilemma, he gives him a bit of good news. He would heal the commander so that he might know that a prophet is in Israel. In other words, this guy needs to know that there's at least one person in Israel that really believes that God can do the things that God can do. So we're going to pick up again in the story in verse 10, read down through verse 14. Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean." But Naaman was furious and went away and said, "Behold, I thought he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abniah or Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. Then his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, you would have not have done it. How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean?" So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was cleansed. There's an old hymn that used to be sung quite often in churches that carries a modern message: trust and obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. But obedience is sort of a 4-letter word, isn't it? I mean, we really don't like obedience. I mean, if we really had things the way we wanted it, we would want God to do the obeying. We want to be in charge. We want to tell him what to do. We want to tell him when and where and what. We want to kind of use him like that genie in the bottle. If we just rub on that bottle with the right prayer, God needs to pop out and give us our 3 wishes, or however many that we want. And then we'll stuff him back in the bottle until we need him later. We don't really want God telling us how to live our lives. Did you notice how Naaman was deeply offended when Elisha did not come out of his house and greet him and swoon over him and make a big display over him? Naaman was simply not used to being treated that way. He was a man of means. But Elisha was following God's way in regard to people who had leprosy. He was supposed to keep his distance. He was not supposed to go near him. And even in this little thing, Elisha obeys. It seems that Naaman expected him really to put on a show, kind of like the prophets of Baal did at Mount Carmel that we studied about last week. But Elisha just didn't do anything at all. He simply just writes out a note and sends that out to him by his servant. Offended, Naaman objected to the very idea that the waters of the Jordan were somehow better than the waters that he is familiar with up there in Damascus. He didn't believe they had any more healing qualities than anything else. And I don't know if you've ever seen what's the current waters in Jordan, but they're pretty stagnant. It's not this beautiful, luxurious river. Now, they have parts of it they've cultivated for tourists that look like this ideal spot. But you go to the rest of it, it's kind of like this nasty old creek. It's not the great big rolling river that we think of. It's not the kind of waters I would want to go dip in. I can understand him saying, these aren't even good waters. Naaman was so outraged by Elisha that he leaves in a rage of fury. Unfortunately, Naaman's servants sort of knew how to speak to their master, telling him that if the prophet had sent him on some great quest, go out and get the chalice or something like that, then he would have done it. We like doing things that make it look like we're deserving. Oh, you want me to go do that, God? I'll go make that sacrifice. I'll go do this thing. And then somehow we think of it as, I've done this thing, and so now I'm worthy. And now I've done it. And God, you have to do your part. But faith and obedience are different. Faith is about trusting God. And trust is expressed in our obedience in even the most simplest of things. It's not what we are asked to do that makes a difference. It's evidencing that we really believe God to be God. He's the one who's in charge. It's Him. We may not even understand or even agree, but God, you're the one who's in charge, and so I'm going to do it. In many ways, baptism is that sort of thing for us today. Jesus commissioned His followers to make disciples by baptizing them and by teaching them to obey all of His commands. But there are a lot of people who resist this simple command because they say, that's just a meaningless symbol that really doesn't matter. It's just a useless ritual that we do at church. But baptism is simply an obedience to the command of Christ. It's a little simple thing that expresses your trust in your faith. And like Naaman, you won't ever do it if you don't think it'll make a difference. It's not the waters. It's the trust in Christ whenever we obey Him. It's what we're doing and why we're doing. Naaman's servant asked him why he was refusing to do something that was so simple. Just go dunk yourself 7 times in the river. Pride. Man, pride. Doesn't it get us? But fortunately, even though it took a little persuasion, Naaman was bigger than his own pride. And I like that part of the story. He was able to swallow his own pride and fall back into obedience and let God be in charge. He goes down to the Jordan River. He must have had all kinds of things going through his mind. Probably those same old arguments that were keeping him from being obedient, those same arguments that were raising his anger. And he puts them aside. He says, okay, God, if this is what you want me to do, I'm going to do it. And he does. And he's healed. He didn't earn it. He didn't deserve it. But he's healed. It wasn't the water. It was God. We're told that his flesh becomes like that of a little child. So there is a new birth aspect to this story as well. Naaman was completely healed of his leprosy, and Naaman knew that there was really a prophet in Israel. And he goes back to that prophet's house. This time, because he was no longer a leper, Elisha comes out and greets him. Naaman declares his faith that there is no other God in all the earth except for Israel. And he wanted to honor God by blessing this servant who had given him the directions. He wanted to give him all of that wealth that he had brought him. And Elisha refused to take any of it. Then Naaman did something I think is pretty strange. He asked Elisha for a load of dirt. He wanted enough dirt that could be pulled by a couple of mules. And so he gets it. This only makes sense when you remember that they associated gods with locations, and so he wanted to take some of the location of Yahweh back to him when he was somewhere else so he could make a place where he could carry out his commitment to worship Yahweh alone. Then Naaman did another weird thing. He asked permission to bow down before the idols that his master, the king of Aram, worshiped. Because he knew when he got back, he would have to accompany him into worship. He was going to have to stand next to him. When the king bowed down, he was going to have to bow down. And he really didn't want to make waves, at least at that point in his life. And so he says, can you grant me this one little thing? And surprisingly, Elisha tells Naaman to go in peace. Now, we'll hear a story later as we're going through these stories about Daniel who refuses to bow down, but that's a different story with a different lesson. But that's not the end of this story. Elisha's servant, and we're finally given his name, Gehazi. He can't bear to see all of that wealth walk away. He sees Naaman leaving. He's seeing all this easy money go, and he's going like, I can't let this happen. And so he runs after Naaman. He finally catches up to him, and Naaman stops. He says, well, what do you need? Is my master well? And God says, no, he's not. He lies, right? He says, no, Elisha needs your help. There's these guests that showed up unexpectedly, and we don't have enough to take care of them. And so could you just give us a little bit so we could treat them right? And Naaman believes the story, and he graciously gives him even more than he asked for. And on the way home, Giza hides his loot. And when he arrives, Elisha, where you been? Giza lied. Elisha knew exactly where he had been, what he had done, and why. Elisha asks him, is it the time to receive money or clothes or olive groves or vineyards or sheep or oxen or male and female servants? Is this the time to get rich? The obvious answer is no. Giza knew it. Elisha pronounced the consequence of his sin. The leprosy of Naaman would cling to him and his descendants forever. And he left Elisha's presence a leper, white as snow. That's the part of the story we don't usually share with our kids when we tell about Naaman being healed. Gaza didn't trust God to provide. But Elisha, my God provides, did trust him. Jesus said that if you believe that God can provide, then you don't have to worry about all the things that the people in the world worry about. You simply need to trust and obey him in all things. That is, you need to seek his kingdom in your life and not worry like the world worries. Because if you worry like the world worries, then you're going to get caught up in the love of money, and it is going to take you into places that are not going to be good for you. Naaman's story is, at least to me, convicting. It brings up the question about our own faith and our own obedience, our own motives, and whether our belief and trust in God leads to faithful obedience. I don't know where you're at with God. Well, some of you I know a little more than others. But wherever you are, it's time to take your next step. Because there's always that next step. And we want to help you take it. We're going to be having a hymn, a closing hymn. So you guys are going to lead that if you come forward. And I want you to be thinking about where God is leading you, where your next step of obedience is. What area is it in your life? It might be one of those first steps, that like baptism. But it might be another one. It may be in some other area of your life. It might be in the area of purity or in the area of obedience or some other area of surrendered living. But God is calling you to be obedient to him, not because he's requiring it of you, but because you trust him. And because you trust him, you're willing to live his way. Would you please stand?